this to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. This is going to be a really good episode and a timely topic, and it's about mail-in ballots and our elections and how we should proceed, what works and what doesn't. You've seen this in the news a lot. This is quite the hot topic, and so I wanted to bring in an expert to help us with this. He is a senior legal fellow and manager of the Heritage Foundation's Election Law Reform Initiative. We have with us Hans von Spakovsky. Hans, thanks so much for being on the show.
Well, I appreciate you inviting me on.
So, let's just start with your background. How did you get into this subject matter? Why are you an expert on this? And what are your general thoughts about the current debate?
25 years ago, I was a lawyer practicing in Atlanta. I got appointed to the county election board. That's in Atlanta, the largest county in the state. So I basically down at the grassroots county level, which is where the real work is done, I was responsible for voter registration, running the polls on election day. I then went to the Justice Department, where I worked enforcing federal voting rights laws, spent 2 years at the Federal Election Commission as a commissioner, and now I work at the Heritage Foundation, where I'm the manager of their election law reform project.
And one of the things that the Heritage Foundation, and this seems to be your work, I would assume, is that there's right now, and counting, 1,285 cases of proven voter fraud.
That's right.
Okay, so how far does that date back to?
Look, we only put this together in the last couple of years, and a lot of media people have been mistakenly saying, "Oh, well, this is the only voter fraud that's ever occurred in the U.S."
They say that all the time, right? Like it's just that one, and you show them another one. Oh, just that one. Well, like what is their limit? I always wondered that.
No, that's totally wrong. The database very carefully says this is a sampling of cases. I don't have the resources to go through and research and do a comprehensive listing of all the voter fraud cases across the country. This is really more recent cases in the last 10 or 20 years. And again, we don't have every case in the country, but what this database does is it shows all the different ways election fraud is committed. And unfortunately for the state of Texas, we have page after page after page of voter fraud prosecutions, everything from impersonation fraud at the polls to the fraudulent use of absentee ballots to ineligible voting by, for example, people who are not U.S. citizens.
So you said Texas. So let's use Texas as an example, because I view Texas as having pretty decent election laws. We have to show our ID. Seems to me to be pretty secure. So is the reason we have all these cases because our system has actual good safeguards on it and we can actually discover voter fraud? Or is it just more prevalent there? Like, are we just not discovering it in other states where it's just easier to vote, no voter ID?
Yes, that is exactly one of the reasons for it. Whenever I get arguments from people saying, "Oh, there's no voter fraud in my state," well, I look at the state and say, "Yeah, well,
how would you
what
catch
have you
it?
got in place to detect it, right?" And a great example of that, of course, is the state of New York, which has no voter ID requirement. So it's very easy there to commit fraud and get away with it. New York also, for example, doesn't do anything to compare its voter registration list with that of other states. So they can't catch the snowbirds, for example, people who live in New York but also spend a lot of time or have a second home in Florida, who illegally register and vote in both places. They just don't seem to be interested in catching the fraud that's occurring.
Yeah, and this list of 1,200 cases, these are proven. These are real cases. These aren't suspected cases. These aren't situations that seem a little bit suspicious, because I hear about those things all the time as well. People will send them to me. Hey, look, my neighbor got multiple ballots sent to their house. I know of this particular location where there's 85 people registered to vote. People will show that kind of stuff all the time, but that's not even the kind of things you're including in this list. This list is, I'm going to read a few examples if you don't mind. So
Sure.
May 2020, a West Virginia mail carrier fraud, where a Pendleton County mail carrier is charged with attempted election fraud. DOJ announced a man has been charged with fraud. According to U.S. Attorney Bill Powell, the mail carrier held a Postal Service contract to deliver mail and alleges that the Pendleton County clerk received 8 2020 primary election COVID-19 mail-in absentee request forms to the courthouse in April that appeared to have had the voters' party ballot requests altered. Okay, that's just one example. These are the kind of things that we're seeing in here. Another one from West Virginia in May, duplicative voting in New Hampshire and Massachusetts in December of 2019. 2 people were found guilty of duplicate voting, one by absentee ballot and then in person in Massachusetts. So they were voting twice. And again, I think a lot of people look at this stuff, then they say, "Oh my God, what is the big deal?" So what is the big deal? I mean, if it's just this one little example, I mean, does that really hurt us?
Well, yeah, it does. Look, if you look at the database, you'll find that some of the cases are people where it's just one individual stealing a vote. Like the student we added just recently who lives in Massachusetts but goes to school at University of New Hampshire and illegally voted in both states. But on the other hand, we have other cases where, for example, Virginia, which is where I live, one of the cases in our database is the mayor of a small town who, along with 14 other people, were all convicted of fraud, including stealing absentee ballots with the intention of rigging the election. And sometimes the fraud is big enough. Yeah, sometimes you're just stealing one person's vote, but other times they're changing the outcome of elections. And, it's everything from stealing votes to other things. I give you just a quick example of this, which you'll appreciate as a member of Congress. Remember, in 2012, there was a woman in Maryland who won the Democratic primary. She was going to challenge the Republican members of Congress. Her name was Wendy Rosen, and someone did some opposition research on her and discovered that, like a lot of people in the North, she and her husband had a second home in Florida, which is not illegal, but it turned out she had voted in both Maryland and Florida in multiple elections. Now, she was forced out of that race, but the key thing about that is this wasn't discovered by election officials. They didn't realize that she was illegally voting in both states. It was discovered because she decided to run for office and somebody did some opposition research on her. That shows you how unaware too many election officials are of what's going on out there.
Well, it's difficult to catch. And if you have loose standards, then there's no way to detect this. And you're sort of caught in this, during this debate, we're always sort of caught in this weird position where they're like, prove it. And we say, okay, fine, here's 1,200 cases. Oh, well, I mean, it's just one vote, here and there. And I say that tongue in cheek because one vote matters. I mean, one vote fraudulently made means another vote is canceled out. And I think that's how Americans need to think about this. And it's, and the question is, what's our margin of error? And why should we accept even a 0.1% margin of error when so many elections are decided by 0.1%? I have some experience in elections myself. And, my first one, I won by 155 votes. And it would be very painful to think that you wouldn't have faith in the system. And that if in the back of your mind, if you lost by that amount, that you would worry that there was fraudulent voting. And again, I don't worry about that as much in Texas because I have to show my ID. They have to know it's me. There's a lot of steps that take place, and I think that's the right thing. And also, sometimes it's not just one or two votes. I'm going to read another one from your list here. Dallas City Council election fraud in November of 2017. In 2017, an investigation of a Dallas City Council election found some 700 fraudulent mail-in ballots signed by the same witness using a fake name. The discovery left 2 council races in limbo, and the fraud was much larger than the vote differential in one of those races. And that resulted in a criminal conviction. And again, we're just lucky in Texas because at least, for mail-in ballots in Texas, you actually have to apply for them. There's a process. You're not just willy-nilly, mailing out ballots to everybody. And maybe we should talk about that for a second because that's the new hotness right now is, hey, let's just mail ballots to everybody and what could go wrong, right? So explain to me, What are the problems associated with that? The chain of custody issues, the voter registration roles, and the problems associated with those. What do you see in your research?
Well, look, there's a lawsuit now in California because the governor there has said, well, we're just going to mail an absentee ballot to every registered voter. Well, the problem with that is that voter registration rolls all over the country are in terrible shape. They're a lot worse in some places like California. Why? Because election officials don't do a very good job of keeping them up to date and accurate. They don't take people off who shouldn't be on there, people who have moved away and don't no longer live at the registered address, people who have died. I mean, it's so bad in California that I think about a year ago, Los Angeles County settled a lawsuit that had been filed against it for not cleaning up its rolls, in which they admitted that they had 1,500,000 individuals registered to vote who shouldn't be on the rolls because they had moved or died. Think about what would happen if you're mailing ballots, literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of ballots to individuals in a big state like California, and they're arriving at people's homes and they no longer live there.
And in California, anybody could fill that out, right? And just send it in?
Yeah,
what's
there's
the process exactly?
There's going to be a temptation for the people at that house to mail to vote that ballot, and because they allow vote harvesting, campaign officials, party activists may come through neighborhoods to collect and scoop up those ballots so they can ensure that they get voted.
Yeah. We remember the 2018 election where a lot of Republicans won the day of the election, but weeks later, as these ballots magically were harvested and came in, they eventually lost, which is, it kind of blows my mind that we would want an election system like that. I mean, this is one of those things where you really don't want any room for error. It always strikes me as strange that this is the one thing Democrats don't want regulated. I always find that should make us all a little bit suspicious. But right. Let's stay on the topic of mail-in ballots. So some states obviously do all mail-in ballots, and what do you think about those states? What are they doing right? What are they doing wrong? And how difficult is it to just mimic what the good systems are?
Well, I think what they're doing is wrong. Now, places like Oregon will tell you, "Oh, it's a great system, and we never have any problems," but they're depending on the U.S. Postal Service for their entire mail election. And to tell you how vulnerable that is, look, the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, this official federal agency, they file a report with Congress every 2 years on every federal election. They collect data from the states. And according to the EAC, in 2016, the presidential election, remember, the margin of victory between the difference in the national vote between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump was 2.9 million votes. Mm-hmm. Well, according to the EAC, there were 6.5 million absentee or mail-in ballots that were reported by the states as misdirected by the Postal Service or unaccounted for. Unaccounted for means the election officials put them in the mail to send to voters and then never heard another word about it. And to tell you how bad things are in Washington and Oregon, and to give you an example of what happens there, listen, I have a colleague. She grew up in Washington State, which now has all mail elections, and she told me recently that even though she hasn't lived there for years, she and her sisters continue to have ballots mailed to them to their parents' house. If they wanted to, they could easily vote those ballots. State of Washington would never realize it. Or in Oregon, some years ago, I was there. The head of their security was talking about how perfect their system was. And an official from another state, election official, leaned over to me and said, well, my sister-in-law lives in Oregon. In the last election, she voted 3 times. And I said, well, how'd she do that? Well, she voted her ballot that arrived in the mail. She voted her husband's ballot that arrived in the mail. And she voted a third ballot that had come in for her because she was registered twice, once under her maiden name and once under her married name, and the state had no idea that had occurred.
Yeah, I mean, and how many examples are there like that? And I'm sure a lot. And that sounds to me like intentional fraud. But I think there's a lot of people that just do it. Maybe even making a mistake. Maybe somebody. I mean, I don't know how you make that big of a mistake. Maybe it's always intentional. But just giving people some benefit of the doubt here is the fact that this isn't necessarily about some big conspiracy to commit mass voter fraud and swing elections.
Right.
It's about the accumulation of small mistakes that itself can swing elections and I think destroy our faith in our own system, which is really problematic. What about mail-in ballots, say in Texas? So if you're, I think, over 65 in Texas, you can get a mail-in ballot, or if you have some disability, but I believe you have to apply for it. So what do you think about those kind of systems that require, I think, more that require more an active role from the voter themselves to request that ballot?
That's the way to do it. Look, nobody disputes that we need absentee ballots, because there are people out there who are sick or physically disabled, or in particular, our military personnel, as you very well know as a former SEAL, who are overseas and need to be able to vote by absentee ballot. But you need to have a system in place where folks request an absentee ballot. One of the reasons for that is that by then mailing you the ballot and mailing you and examining the request for an absentee ballot, there's a ability to authenticate that it's a real voter and it's really that voter who's requested the ballot, and that makes it, it's not a foolproof system, but it's much better than simply mailing a ballot to every registered voter.
Yeah, exactly. No, but it's still not foolproof, and that's an important note. So why isn't it still foolproof? Is it because it's hard to authenticate the person, or is it because of the break in custody when they actually mail it?
Well, it's both that and the fact that one of the only things that states do is they're supposed to do a signature comparison. In other words, they compare the signature on the absentee ballot with the signature they have in file. But they have very, very loose standards on that. They let a lot of stuff get by because of the fact that if you're registered, for example, for a long time, your signature tends to change, particularly as you get older. So they're just not very good at that.
Yeah, they're not trained. That blows my mind.
And they're not trained.
Blows my mind that that's the thing that we came up with. Let's compare signatures. It's laughable. It's laughable for something as important as a vote. That let's have them scribble something, okay?
Right.
And we'll compare it from years ago when they scribbled the same thing. I mean, come on, this is ridiculous. And so what? I forget the statistic. I think it was maybe in your research or in my notes somewhere, but there was like hundreds of thousands in the last election, maybe 400,000. Yes, here we go. So one of the most, here is in my notes here, one of the most serious issues with mail-in ballots is that a voter can't have confidence their vote counts. Out of 33 million mail-in ballots that were cast in the 2016 presidential election, 400,000 of them didn't count. They were thrown out, having been disqualified for reasons ranging from invalid signatures to simply being late. So here's my analysis of this particular fact. And it seems like, so I have 400,000 here. You stated there was 6 million. I think we're probably counting different things there. But the point is this: there's two things that could have occurred here. They were thrown out because somebody intentionally tried to commit fraud, like it actually wasn't the person, and the election official was correct in throwing it out, or the election official was incorrect in throwing it out because they just, like you said, maybe somebody's signature changed, or it's a silly system to begin with. And their vote didn't count, even though it was a valid voter. Either way, those are both terrible scenarios.
No, they are. And the other thing that can happen with absentee ballots is, they require voters to also put a certain amount of information on the outer envelope about the voter. And if you don't get all that information on there correctly, your ballot won't count. And the issue there is with in-person voting, that's not going to happen.
Right.
The election officials are right there to check you in, to make sure you're a registered voter, and those kind of problems aren't going to happen. And how many people out there listening to your podcast, how many of them have gotten mail at their apartment or house that was misdirected, meant for somebody else,
all the time,
at a different address?
all the time.
Right.
I still
And how many folks have gotten mail for somebody who at their apartment or house who used to live there? Right. It happens all the time. You really want to trust the Postal Service to deliver your absentee ballot?
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, I know for a fact my mail is still going to Boston address when I was at Harvard. I mean, and part of this is my fault, right? Like I don't change my address in every single database that I'm in. And this just happens, but everybody does this. We all know this happens,
right.
Because everybody moves and we go from state to state. We have a highly mobile society, and none of us are that great about continuously updating our stuff. And so our mail kind of tends to go to different places. It just happens. It's not this intentional fraudulent activity all the time, but mistakes happen. You mentioned, so this is a good time to hit on this. You mentioned, voting in person, you don't have this problem. Okay, what about voting in person with no voter ID? I mean, I voted in California, but I can't recall exactly how they did it. I guess I just told them my name because this was years ago, but I guess I just told them my name and they just assumed like, that sounds good. You seem like a Dan Crenshaw to me. Go ahead and vote. Like, I mean, what other safeguards do they have, if any?
No, well, they don't. And to show you how bad that is, there's actually a report. People can find it on the internet, put out by the New York City Department of Investigations. They had gotten reports about bad things going on at the New York City Elections Department, including the fact that they weren't cleaning up their voter registration list. So on Election Day in 2013, for the mayor's race, they sent their undercover people into various polling places around New York City to ask for the ballots because they have no ID requirement. You just go in, give a name, they give you a ballot. They sent their undercover people in to ask for the ballots of folks who, based on their investigation, were dead or had moved out of state or were otherwise no longer eligible to vote. Every single one of their undercover people was handed a ballot, and they tried to make it as easy as possible for election officials to figure out a problem. The best example of that was they had a young African-American agent who they sent in to ask for the ballot of a white elderly woman in her 80s who had died and therefore should no longer be on the list. She was handed a ballot. The only undercover agent that didn't get a ballot was a guy who went into a polling place to ask for the ballot of a criminal who was in the state penitentiary in New York and therefore unable to vote. And he wasn't handed a ballot because the person working in the polling place at the registration desk was the prisoner's mother.
That's a small world. It just seems ridiculous. So since you're so close to this debate all the time, do they have any valid arguments about some people not being able to access IDs, and that's why it's somehow oppressive to force people to use IDs to vote? I mean, what numbers do they use? Do they even use any data or facts to back up that claim?
The opponents of this, and they did this. Look, Texas had to fight a long litigation fight to get its voter ID law in place. The opponents of this use these mythical numbers, claiming huge numbers of Americans don't have an ID and can't get one.
Yeah.
And that has been proven to be totally untrue. First of all, Americans, including folks in Texas, overwhelmingly already have an ID. Just about everybody has a driver's license. Mm-hmm. Plus, every state, including Texas, that's put an ID requirement in place, has put in a law saying, listen, if you don't have an ID already, we'll provide you one free from the state.
Yeah.
Despite all that, opponents keep trying to say we shouldn't have voter ID laws. But look, we've got more than a decade's worth of turnout data now on voter ID states. Georgia and Indiana, for example, their voter ID laws were in place for the 2008 election when Barack Obama got elected. That turnout data shows that not only do voter ID requirements not depress the votes, including they don't depress the votes of minority voters, well, in many of the states where they put in an ID requirement, turnout seemed to go up. after the ID requirement is in. Nobody knows if it's connected or not, but there's some folks that speculate that's because it may have been because it increased the public confidence in the integrity of the election process.
Yeah, I mean, it's just on its face, the argument against voter ID is it's backwards. I mean, it's vapid. It's empty. There's nothing to it, and it blows my mind. I mean, and if you really cared about people, if you really cared about people's well-being and their ability to prosper in a modern society, and you truly believe that they don't have access to identification, well, then your biggest priority's got to be getting them identification. Because you need it for so many things. I mean, to get a job, to be a functioning member of society, you need some form of ID. That's just fundamentally true. And this continues to blow my mind that we even have this debate. I'm always trying to dissect the psychology of my opponents and figure out like where they're going with this, if there's some underlying reason that we're not seeing. But in this case, there's none. This is a real mystery to me. And I don't like attributing bad intentions to people's ideas or policy ideas, but it does seem in this case that the only reason that you would want these regulations to be so unbelievably loose is because you want to make it easier to tinker with the system. And I just find it highly suspicious. And so actually we just voted on some legislation about a week and a half ago to do just that, to make it easier. And in the HEROES Act, which has no chance of becoming law, just so everybody knows, it just passed out of the House. It would mandate the counting of late ballots postmarked before Election Day with a uniform 10 days to cure bad signatures. The bill also says states, quote, shall permit a voter to designate any person to return a vote in sealed absentee ballot, end quote, on the sole condition that canvassers aren't paid for it. Okay, so you can't pay the canvassers to harvest votes, but volunteers can go out and basically impose ballot harvesting nationwide. And the thing about, and so when we also said that it would basically subvert or basically render moot all voter ID laws, the reason we say that is because it's a federal mandate for mail-in ballots naturally subverts voter ID laws. But just by nature of doing that, when would you show your ID? So it's really problematic. I mean, what else did you think of? Did you look into that legislation very deeply? Maybe you didn't because it wouldn't become law, but
no, I did, because in fact it has all these terrible provisions. You've named many of them with regard to mail-in ballots. And the thing about it is that they basically took all of these provisions, which have nothing to do with the coronavirus. They took all of these out of HR 1. Remember, HR 1 is the first bill. The first bill that Democrats sponsored in Congress when they took over after the 2018 election.
Right.
And it was
a flagship bill. It's HR 1. And this is important for people. I just want to interrupt for just a second. That's important for people to understand. We name the bills what we want to name the bills. And generally speaking, whatever party's in charge reserves something like number 1 and number 2 and number 3 and number 4 for really major pieces of legislation that they want to pass, right? Because a lot of times we'll have a bill and it's called HR 7725. Like that's nobody knows what that is, right? But HR 1, people remember that. HR 3, that's the drug pricing bill. Like we know what that one is. This is a flagship bill, and they named it number 1 for a reason. This is a big priority for them. And again, the psychology behind that is beyond me. So anyway, please continue.
Well, HR 1 was in essence a federal takeover of running elections across the country. It would have overridden all these state laws and done things like prohibited any state from having a voter ID requirement. It would have required states to allow vote harvesting. All these things that would decrease the security of the election process. And they've basically taken many of those provisions and put them into every bill that supposedly is supposed to only deal with the problems caused by COVID-19. And look, people should keep in mind, Congress already appropriated, and the president signed into a law in the CARE Act, which was the bill that did get passed, $400 million that has already been distributed to the states to help them deal with any extra costs that might come up in their election process with dealing with the COVID-19 virus.
Yeah, I want to talk about that for a second, and then I want to get back to the federal role in elections, because we breezed over that a little bit, but it's important. I want to talk about it. But yeah, but since you talked about the $400 million from the Help America Vote Act, I think this is an important point too. Let's all step back and put our partisan hats aside for a second and just use some common sense. Okay. You know that a disease transmits when people are really in close contact for a prolonged period of time. Okay, so how do you prevent that? Well, grocery stores have pretty much figured it out. You just, you don't allow people to stand in line really close to each other. You put little stickers on the ground so that people can be away from each other. When you go to the cash register, they generally have plexiglass in front of them. And here's what's beyond me, and this is how I tell people that I think we can vote just fine. If you can go to the grocery store, touch a bunch of things, put them in a cart that other people have touched, wait in line with other people, put them on a conveyor belt, have somebody else touch those things, and then allow somebody else to touch those same things and put them in a grocery bag, and then you take them home and eat those things that everybody just touched, and you don't get sick, you think maybe that we can stand in line and vote at a machine where we actually don't even have to handle the same things, we actually don't have to really interact closely with anybody. So from a common sense standpoint, it's just beyond me. But like you said, the $400 million, that was, for purposes of, I don't know, maybe renting out bigger spaces so we can space out the polling booths a little bit better, or put plexiglass in front of people, buy hand sanitizer. So if you're touching a machine like we do in Texas, you can sanitize it after every time. There's very common sense ways to do this without completely reforming our entire election system.
Well, look, it's not just common sense. It's been done.
Yeah, it's true. It's been done.
I actually just recently published a paper for the Heritage Foundation that outlined how Liberia held a national election successfully using every health safety protocol you just described in 2014 in the midst of the Ebola epidemic in West Africa, which is a heck of a more dangerous disease. Same thing, Wisconsin, April 7th. They just had their primary. A large number of people voted by absentee ballot, but over 300,000 people in Wisconsin voted in person. And they went they took elaborate steps to make sure that their polling places had everything from social distancing in the lines, which was closely monitored, to, in their case, they use paper ballots and OptiScan machines, to disposable pens, ballots in plastic sleeves handed to the voters, sanitation stations inside the polling place, cleaning the voting booths that people were using before and after a voter used it, all of that. And the latest report that's just been published not too long ago on that says there's been no spike in COVID-19 infections because of the election.
Exactly. So I want to read something here. It's I'll paraphrase it. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, it empowers states to determine the time, place, and manner of elections. So this is one of the reasons we always have a problem when Democrats try to pass something like H.R. 1 and basically implement a federal takeover of elections. But what's the right balance? Because we obviously see some states that do a lot of the bad practices that you've mentioned, that the potential for mistakes and voter fraud is rampant. We see examples of it all the time. So, I mean, what is the right balance? I mean, should the Trump administration, flex more muscle in order to make states do what we need to do? Can there be national voter ID? I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, the founders divided responsibility between the states and the feds when it comes to elections. So, for example, while Congress can set the time, place, and manner of federal elections, they can't do that with regard to state elections. So the state elections, county commission races, state legislative races, feds don't have any say-so over that other than the Voting Rights Act, for example, which says you obviously can't discriminate in that context. But on the other hand, states have 100% authority. Congress doesn't have any at all under the Constitution for the eligibility to vote. States can determine who is eligible to vote. And that would mean, for example, that states have the ability to put in voter ID laws, because that's part of determining if somebody is eligible to vote or not. And that's why I think, for example, that a federal statute that outlawed voter ID requirements would be unconstitutional. There's a limit that the president can't really do that much. Congress does have a great deal of authority that it shares with the states, but every time they've tried to exercise that in recent years, it hasn't been to do something good.
Yeah.
It's been to do something bad.
Right. But so if Congress did vote to nationalize voter ID, which would be good for elections, but even if it's just federal elections, do you think that would still be unconstitutional?
That is a question that I'm not sure what the answer to it is. Yeah. I think the Supreme Court actually made a mistake some years ago when they ruled against a requirement that Arizona and Kansas had put in place that requires proof of citizenship when you register to vote. There was the Supreme Court saying that violated the National Voter Registration Act. I don't think that's right. And in fact, I think that's one of the things other things that states need to do, or Congress needs to do, in addition to voter ID, is we ought to require proof of citizenship when you register to vote, because we have a problem, including in Texas, of people who are not U.S. citizens registering, voting, and not getting caught doing it.
No, that's right. I mean, like I said, even in Texas, we still have problems. And Governor Abbott was sued recently by Democrats who claim that current Texas law should be reinterpreted to allow any voter to cast a mail-in ballot during the coronavirus outbreak. I believe the Texas Supreme Court just overruled that, though. So we're still safe in Texas. But it's not just Republicans that have concerns in Texas. There's other voting rights advocate groups that have expressed concern because it's too easy to throw out a ballot if officials decide the signature doesn't look right. I mean, it's this goes both ways, and that's a valid reason to be concerned. It's just one of the reasons mail-in ballots they can only work so well. What I want to ask about too is, you've written a piece on this, is electronic voting, or I guess internet voting. Right. And every millennial thinks that everything should be done on their phone, and for the most part, they're right. We like that. I am a millennial. I bank on my phone. That seems to work for me okay. If somebody's trying to steal my credit card, I get a little alert. That seems like a decent system. So why can't we do the same with voting?
Well, because every group of experts, and by experts I mean people, including from Silicon Valley, who have looked at this, have all warned that the security vulnerabilities in the way the internet is organized, plus in the hardware and software that's ubiquitous, everybody uses, are too great to allow this. And yeah, lots of people often say, well, if I can bank, why can't I vote that way? Well, the difference is, first of all, I don't think a lot of people realize how much financial fraud there is over the internet. Retailers, banks, and others just include that in their cost of business. But here's the problem. Look, if somebody gets into your bank account over the internet and drains your account, you're going to know it, because you get a statement, you get a warning from the bank. You can see that the money has been drained. But if you vote over the internet, there's no way for you to know whether your vote in between your machine, your home computer, and when it arrives over the internet election, you have no idea whether it got there or whether it was changed. And in fact, a computer software guy I know told me, listen, people constantly have problems with viruses and Trojan horses, things like that, getting onto their laptops. He said it would be so easy to design a virus that would get into people's laptops, sit there quietly, and then if and when you vote, it would know that you're doing that, and it could change your vote without you knowing it and send it out that way. And there's no way to detect that.
Yeah, and I read your piece because I had the same question, and I didn't know how to answer that. But what you're saying makes sense. I mean, a lot of like banks in the financial system, they actually budget for a loss in revenue because of this, and so they build in a margin of error into their system. But again, the question is, can we really do that for elections when you're a single fraudulent vote or a single mistaken vote actually cancels out a legitimate vote. Maybe I'll ask you about this one last thing. I have so many data points that I want to, but I think we've covered them all for the most part. I thought it was interesting recently. Just kind of want to throw this out there, get your take on it. President Trump was fact-checked, quote unquote, fact-checked by Twitter because he had some pretty, in typical Trump fashion, he had some pretty big things to say about voter fraud. In the end, I don't see how you fact check what is basically a very exaggerated prediction by the president. I don't think that is fact checkable. So he may have overstated it, but I mean, what were your thoughts on that? But it's obviously, given our conversation, it's obviously possible.
Well, what I would say about that is that I think the president, frankly, ordinary voters have a right to be concerned over the push to go to all mail elections because, as you and I have discussed in great detail here, mail-in ballots are much more vulnerable to all kinds of problems, from intimidation, pressure on voters to being forged or stolen or altered. And the more mail-in ballots are used, the greater the potential for that. So I don't think it's wise to go that way, particularly because I don't think it's necessary, because I think states already have demonstrated that with the same precautions in place that are allowing us to go grocery shopping, we can easily show up at our polling places to vote.
Yeah, I was looking through my notes here. I found that example I brought up earlier. In 2016, 83 registered voters were at a location in San Pedro, California. So they all receive absentee ballots into this small 2-bedroom apartment. I'm pretty sure 83 people don't live there. And how does this even happen? I truly don't understand it. Is it 83 people trying to game the system, or is this truly a mistake? How does this even happen?
Well, we don't have enough details to know. It could have been misdirected mail, but on the other hand, look, our system, particularly the system in California, is so unsecure that I can pretty much guarantee you that if I was living in California, I could easily mail in 10 or 20 voter registration forms, all under different names. And I'll just about guarantee you that I would easily get registered without any questions by election officials. And once that happened, I could easily request absentee ballots. That's one of the ways that massive absentee ballot fraud was committed in Miami-Dade in 1997 that caused the mayor's race to get overturned. People were registering phony people to vote using mail-in registration and then requesting absentee ballots. And it's very, unfortunately, it's very easy to do.
It's frustrating. And going back to the forgeries issue, I have another story here. According to Melody Rose, an assistant professor of political science at Portland State University, I don't have much faith in that process. I can forge my husband's signature perfectly. I think most married couples would agree with that fact. Rose conducted a survey of one county, Washington County, outside Portland. 5% of registered voters admitted that other people marked their ballots. 2.4% said someone else even signed their ballots. So you could argue, oh, that's single digits. Well, yeah, but that's an entire county, and rarely are elections won by landslides. I mean, these margins actually matter. It's kind of unbelievable. About ballot harvesting, I think for the same reason. So in 27 states, a voter can actually designate someone to return their ballot. So 27 states, ballot harvesting is actually allowed. Again, what have you seen? Is this How often is this fraudulent in nature, or is it usually above bar, but there's just potential for fraud, or do we know?
We don't know the answer to that. I mean, look, part of what President Trump tried to do is, remember, when he first came into office, he appointed a presidential advisory commission on election integrity. I was actually appointed as a member of it. And the committee, we were going to try to investigate and research this entire issue. I mean, part of what we were going to try to do was try to figure out how much fraud is there across the country. Liberals just went crazy.
I remember
over this thing. I mean, we had no power to do anything. All we could do was do research and then make recommendations to Congress and the president. But they got so upset that we were even going to research the issue that they ended up filing a dozen lawsuits against the commission, and the president dissolved it because we were unable to get any work done, because all we were doing was answering these frivolous lawsuits.
Well,
so
that's not what the media said.
We don't know the extent of the problem.
The media said you guys dissolved because there was nothing to see here. I remember the stories. Like, they were like, "Oh, President Trump, he wanted to prove that there was some election fraud, and they couldn't prove it, so they just dissolved the commission." Yeah, it's not true. It's just unbelievable. This is a real sticking point for the left, and that's why I wanted to do this podcast and show on this so badly, because this is the one thing in politics that they don't want regulated, and that should make the hair stand up on everybody's back of their neck, because this is deeply suspicious. Elections are so important. The sanctity of our elections is so important, and the lengths to which they will go to lie to people, to manipulate people, to make you believe that voter ID is racist. I mean, these things are complete nonsense. But they've got a lot of people believing it, and the manipulation is wide and far, and getting the facts out is extremely important. So I've got to be respectful of your time, and I got a hard out. You have anything else you want to add before we end?
No, just that I agree with you. This should not be a partisan issue, and it actually used to not be a partisan issue. It's something everybody should be concerned about, and the polling shows the public is very concerned about this, no matter what their political background, no matter what their race or ethnicity. An overwhelming majority of people think about this, are worried about it, and support common sense measures like voter ID.
And rightfully so. Hans, thank you so much for being on the show and helping us with this. Appreciate your